Welcome to the Concordia Publishing House Podcast, where we consider everything in the light of Jesus Christ, who is the same yesterday, today, and forever. I'm your host, Elizabeth Pittman. The Lutheran Confessions are a treasure for the church that remain extremely relevant to our lives as Christians today. Our guest today is Pastor Andy Wright, author of Faithfully Formed, The Lutheran Confessions in Daily Life. As we chat, he'll help us see how the Confessions offer guidance and comfort for us as Christians today. Before we start our conversation with Reverend Wright, I'd like to thank our friends at the LCMS Foundation for their support of the CPH podcast. How can your congregation turn significant financial gifts into a long-term funding source that blesses your church for generations to come? The LCMS Foundation was created to provide professional investment services to LCMS churches, schools, and RSOs. They've helped hundreds of congregations create, manage, and grow endowments using investments tailored to each congregation's unique goals and needs. And now they'd like to help yours. Learn more at lcmsfoundation.org/podcast. Now onto our conversation with Reverend Andy Wright. Pastor Wright, welcome to the CPH podcast.
Thanks to be with you today. It's a lot of fun.
It's nice to have you here. But before we start talking about the heart of the matter of why we have you on today, tell our listeners a little bit about you. You're a new author for CPH, so you'll be new to many of our listeners. Tell them a little bit about where you're from, your ministry, and your family.
Sure. Yeah, I am originally from Circleville, Ohio, and that's just south of Columbus, so kind of the south central Ohio area. And I grew up in the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America. I was actually baptized in the ALC, and then I'm old enough for that at least. And then I grew up in the ELCA, and my family would always vacation all the time when my parents were retired school teachers. And it was never a question if we were going to go to church on Sundays. Even on vacation, it just one of the first things we did was the closest Lutheran church. And so we learned more about the LCMS and kind of over time. And as I was going through confirmation and even into high school, started getting kind of aware of some of the issues that were going on in the ELCA, and we became LCMS. So then when I was looking at going to college, I've always wanted to be a pastor and an astronaut my whole life. I can't remember a time when I didn't want to be a pastor. I can't remember a time when I didn't want to be an astronaut. So there are stories of babysitters of me and one moment, turning like chairs upside down to rocket off into space. And then the next moment I'll pull out a Bible and preach a sermon. So that's just always been that way. And I've always loved going to church and everything pertaining to aviation. So when I was looking at what I wanted to do, I looked at different programs with engineering, aviation, and looked at some of our, like the U.S. Naval Academy and things like that as well. And I started getting my pilot's license in high school. I started off at Concordia, Wisconsin then, and then I transferred to Concordia, Ann Arbor. So I'm a graduate of Concordia University, Ann Arbor. And it was at Ann Arbor where I met my wife, Rebecca. She's from Michigan. I'm from Ohio. So that it works out okay. So we jokingly say, that have a mixed marriage in that regard, but went to graduated from college from Concordia University, Ann Arbor. I went to the Fort Wayne Seminary, started off there in 2007. And then I served my vicarage in Florida on the Gulf Coast of Florida. Came back for my fourth year. I was asked to be a graduate assistant at the seminary. So I was the graduate assistant for Concordia Theological Quarterly, the journal that Fort Wayne puts out, working on my coursework for my Master of Sacred Theology. And then in 2012, so I graduated with my MDiv in 2011. And then in 2012, I took a call to St. John Lutheran Church in Keystone, Iowa. And so then I was ordained that summer and served in Iowa for 10 years. And my children were born in Iowa. My oldest she turned 10 this past year, and our youngest is 3. And so he'll be 4 in August. So we have 4 girls and 1 boy. And
so it's busy. It's busy in your home.
Keeps us very busy, but that's the good kind of busy. They have their moments, they're kids. But with that, So then in 2022, trying to get my dates right here, then I took a call to be the senior pastor of St. John's Evangelical Lutheran Church in Topeka, Kansas. So went from St. John in Keystone to St. John's in Topeka. So keeping all that straight, it's then, and to make, when I first got the call here too, the president of the congregation, his first name was Andy. So I would get things from St. John from Andy, and I didn't know. Did I send that email? Did something coming back to me? I don't know. So with that, so I've been here ever since. So in that meantime, in that course of time, then through all those years, I finished up my master's of sacred theology and systematic theology. Kind of my area is the Lutheran Confessions. I started the PhD program and finished my coursework. I have my languages done, my major exam done. So I'm in the dissertation process for my PhD in doctrinal theology from Concordia Seminary in St. Louis. And my advisor is Dr. Robert Kolb. So he is my doctoral
Excellent.
father. And so
Excellent.
pertaining to confessions, that works really well. So that's kind of my at least my background in terms of some of those things of kind of leading up into ministry. So here at St. John's in Topeka, we have a pretty active congregation. We have an associate pastor. We have a cantor. We also have a classical Lutheran school. So there's always stuff going on. We had a luncheon yesterday. Today, there's music camp going on throughout the week. We have a music academy here as well. We have great musicians. We have there's always something going on. Always work to be done. But that's another good kind of busy where people are very active, very congregation that loves Bible studies, congregation that loves to learn, congregation that very well catechized, and so privileged by God to serve here in this place.
It sounds like a thriving congregational community, and it's nice to see that and to see how excited you are to talk about it, which obviously translates down to your members.
Yeah.
So here in a couple of weeks, your first book is going to be released, Faithfully Formed: The Lutheran Confessions in Daily Life, which seems to be in your wheelhouse given your course of study and what you've been doing. And there's been a lot of enthusiasm for this book as we've come out. I was just sharing before we got started. It's currently ranked number one new release on Amazon in Lutheran Christianity. So that's fun to see the enthusiasm for it. Before we go too deep into the topics of the book, for any of our listeners who may not be Lutheran or who may not be familiar with the Lutheran Confessions, what are they? What are we talking about as the foundation for the rest of the conversation for your book?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a good question because depending on who you're talking to, even if they're from a non-Lutheran, circles, and you talk about the Lutheran Confessions, the first thing that you'll often get the response of, you mean like in a little box with a priest? Like I've gotten that response often, like, well, no, we're not talking about that. However, we have confession and absolution, but we're talking about these documents. And then the next question that they ask, so do you follow the Bible, right? So how does this interplay? So there's always a lot of follow-up questions with it. So when we talk about the Lutheran Confessions, we're talking about the Book of Concord. That's another term that we'll use in the discussion. And the Book of Concord contains various different documents. The first three documents in the Lutheran Confessions are the three ecumenical creeds: the Apostles' Creed, the Nicene Creed, and the Athanasian Creed. And then from those documents, then we have the Augsburg Confession is a document, the Apology of the Augsburg Confession. We have the Smalcald Articles, the Treatise on the Power and Primacy of the Pope, the Small Catechism, the Large Catechism, and the Formula of Concord, which includes what's called the Epitome, and then the Solid Declaration. So kind of a short version and a longer version. It's more complicated than that, but for all intents and purposes. And so when we use this term, then we're talking about all of those doctrines. And then in around 1580, they were all compiled together in what we know as the Book of Concord. So I have a big, in our house, this tells you how much of a nerd with the confessions I am, a title page of the Book of Concord from 1580. It's a print of that hanging up there. Concordia is another term that you'll see. So, in the LCMS, like you say Concordia and you have to clarify, what do you
Which
mean
one?
yeah, which one? Yeah. We have everything is named Concordia, but that's a telling thing, though, too, of the seriousness that we take when it comes to the Book of Concord in the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod. So the Lutheran Confessions, then, these are these documents, and what they do is they confess what the Scriptures say. So God's word, is His word. It's inspired. It's inerrant. It's the very breath and voice of God that we have. And in Matthew 16, Jesus asked His disciples, "Who do you say that I am?" And Peter answers, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." So the very nature of the Christian faith is to confess. It's to say back what God has revealed about who we are as sinners, who He is as God, that faith that He has given to us. So we give answer or confess what the Scriptures say. So the Lutheran Confessions are nothing other than our confession of the Christian faith, of what we say, who God is, who we are, how do we fit into all this? What is the church? So another term then that we'll use, like for us as pastors or church workers, use this term too, of subscription, that we subscribe to the confessions. So at my ordination, for instance, I took a vow where I said that, I agree with the Lutheran Confessions because they are in agreement with the Scriptures. So everything that the Lutheran Confessions teach is what the Scriptures teach. So when you look at something like baptism, then in like the Large Catechism or in the Augsburg Confession, that is what the Scriptures teach on baptism. It is a faithful confession of that. And I make these my own so when the congregation called me to be their pastor, they knew what I was going to teach, because they knew that I am confessing this same confession of the faith because of what the confessions are confessing. So that's kind of I think the short way of for us to understand it. I always, my mom's a retired English teacher, and English teachers always tell you don't define something by the word itself. But I think that's helpful when it comes to the Lutheran Confessions. They confess the Scriptures, and all that entails and unpacks. But so that's usually the best way that I at least try to, in a short amount of time, tell somebody, just an introduction to the Lutheran Confessions.
So as I was reading in the introduction to your book, the book came about through the course of you teaching it over time at your congregation. Tell us a little bit about, and I think you will see some people who will say, why do these dusty old documents matter to me today? How is this relevant for me? Unpack that a little bit, and how in some examples of where you've seen the light bulb go on with people that you've been teaching of, oh, this is how this applies to me right here and now.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's kind of come about. I've always had a love for the confessions. And I mentioned that I grew up in the ELCA, and one of the things that we started doing before we became LCMS is I would ask my pastor a lot of questions, and then I heard about the Lutheran Confessions. So I started looking at them beyond the small catechism and started reading, what is it they teach, and does this align with what was going on? So it's always kind of been a part of my life, even personally, in that regard of, hey, this is something important, and what's going on here with that. So then having the love of studying them, and then once I became a pastor, I'm very much one of that doctrine and practice go together. You don't just have some abstract notion of doctrine, and then it's just like, well, that's not really relevant for our lives. No, these things really go together, and this is where the love of the pastoral concern of the Lutheran Confessions really shine forth. So I started, I would always then kind of work them into Bible studies. I would always work them in, different parts of sermons, teaching confirmation class, teaching adult confirmation class. But then I really started to kind of pick up on how much it even informed how I ministered to God's people. And really, like, being with, for instance, how does, being with a mother who just lost her daughter in an accident, something along those lines, this terrible situation that you hope and pray to God every day that you never have to deal with, but yet you do. And as a pastor, you're where you want to be to proclaim that word of comfort. how did that form? How does the doctrine of baptism provide comfort to this mother who's grieving the loss of her daughter who you just confirmed like a year ago? Or something along those lines. And it really took shape. Or in Iowa, I mentioned this in the book, that we had a Bible study on Thursday mornings at 6:30 in the morning. Now for me, that's much easier to deal with than in the evening. I'm much more of a
I
morning person.
agree.
Yeah.
Same.
Once 7 o'clock hits, like I'm just, whew. Sometimes those Christmas Eve services, or that we have an Easter Vigil service, I'm like half awake and I couldn't tell you, what I did at some of those. But so I'm much more of a morning person. So we would have this Bible study at 6:30 in the morning, and we did an intentional study of the Reformation. We would hit 2017, for instance, talking about, we did a whole unit on the Reformation and Luther, and we were talking about the confessions. And some of the guys, this was a men's group, they said, well, I've never read the confessions. Why don't we, study those? To which I was pretty quick to say, all right, sounds good. We'll do it, and so we sat down and we approached the study of, listen, we're just going to open this up. We're going to sit around a table. We're just going to start reading. And whatever questions come up, whatever things happen, we'll just do that. And along this time too, I had also been asked to lead a kind of an online read through of the confessions one time that I wrote some commentary on, and just kind of, so I'd been working a lot in this. And then with my STM work, I had done stuff with that. So when we started sitting down then on 6:30 in the morning on a Thursday and reading through some of these documents that some of these guys had never heard of before. But yeah, and you just look at them like, well, what do I need to know? What's a small cult article? And why is this important? But then you start reading like the section on confession and about how God doesn't want to deal with us other than through his means of grace, and the great comfort that we have, that we don't have to go searching for God, but he's actually found us and he promises to be with us, and he gives us himself and his benefits in these things. So you start to see the light bulb go on, like, wait a minute. Hey, this helps me to know who I am as a Christian. It helps me to know where God is found, and it helps me even in my life. So when you have the grandfather who's encouraging his grandchildren, hey, you need to be in church. It's not just about, hey, God commands it. He does. He does command it. However, but to be able to confess to them, listen, these are the great benefits that God gives to us. This is what we're sharing in, and this is the comfort that I have when I come to church, knowing that God is here, that he's for me, he gives me these things. So it started to really start to form them. It formed how they lived out their Christian life as Christian husbands and fathers and grandfathers, or even just neighbors, with that. So that really then started to take shape of like, boy, we really see how these are formative in our lives. And then once you see that firsthand, or the questions that people come up with as you're reading through this, that's always a fascinating thing, for somebody who likes to study these things. The things that, when the questions that I have are not always the questions that, somebody who, who's maybe, is facing like his crops are not doing well, and he has a question when it comes to these things, but it's relevant to what we're talking about, but to see how that really applies, and to see how that really speaks to them in a way that is faithful, and in a way that enables them then to confess the faith as well. And
What are some of the common questions that you have heard from people about the confessions?
yeah, that's a good question. Some of the common questions, kind of the first one, what are they? Another common one too is, aren't those just for pastors? I think that's another common one, and because it's kind of intimidating. I mean, I have like, here's the Concordia edition, right? I mean, that's a thick book, right? And so to some people that's pretty intimidating, you know. So that's a common one, isn't that just a book for pastors? And then, you address, well, actually, let's look at, is this a book for pastors, or is it for everybody? Another common one is like, well, are we saying something as an addition to the scriptures? I think that's another very common one you come across. Like, so it's like, I thought we just believed the Bible, so then explaining that role between, the norming norm. I talk about this in the introduction, or the normed norm, and what does that mean, that the confessions are normed by the scriptures? which is also, I think, a helpful thing in how we then approach them and apply them to our lives. Um, just kind of some other documents too, like just people just have questions about the documents themselves too, like you know are they all written by Luther? Are they all um, you know are they all just written for that specific time, kind of those kind of things. So it's quite a gambit, but the most common ones deal with what are they, and aren't they just for pastors, or kind of what role do they play?
Tell us a little bit about how, as we study the confessions, we're able to recognize God at work in our daily lives.
Sure. Yeah, I think kind of first and foremost, it's kind of that that we start to kind of just actually use them and read them. So what I mean by that is there's a couple of places in the confessions. Luther does this in the Large Catechism. It's done in the Formula of Concord, and then it's referenced kind of in roundabout ways too as well, where they use the phrase "think about it." You know, sometimes in preaching, I'll make a comment or read a scripture passage that say, "Think about that for a minute." Just let that sit there and kind of let that roast there, over the fire for a minute, and let's unpack this and see what this entails. So when we think about them in our daily lives, it's to kind of borrow from the collect we have to read, mark, learn, and inwardly digest. I think that's a helpful principle as well, with the confessions, that we think about what's being said, how is this being said, and who am I in this? So, yeah, there are parts of the confessions that are kind of more kind of theological treatises, or they are kind of pretty high and lofty, but they speak to us on our daily lives, even from just a standpoint too of as God's people. We are both preachers and hearers. So I'm a preacher of the word. I'm a hearer of the word too. I don't cease to be that. But one of the things that as a layperson you have the same confession, that you are able to know truth from error. You're able to judge. Hey, this is something that's worthwhile. There's so many voices crying out. You can turn on the internet and just hear all kinds of stuff, and it helps us kind of get that compass, or to kind of navigate through all of this and say, hey, this is worth listening to, this is not. Because at the end of
Well,
the day, what's underlining the confessions is the proclamation of Christ, fully and completely, and that faithful confession of the scriptures. So that's even just from that specific standpoint. But yeah, go ahead.
well, let's go a little deeper there, because you brought up going onto the internet and seeing what people are saying. We're in a culture today where truth is relative, depending on who you talk to. People are having serious questions about gender and sexuality and identity.
Hmm.
How can a deeper understanding of the Lutheran confessions help us understand and communicate in that environment?
Sure. Yeah, I think where this is a really helpful thing for us today is that to help us navigate how to think through all of this, and then respond. So what the confessions do as a faithful confession of the scriptures is they get us to start thinking about, okay, who creates us? What does that mean that he creates us? Who am I as a creature of God? What does that mean that I'm a creature of God? What does that mean then that I'm a Christian? And what does that mean for my life? So it kind of gets us into this of, how do I fit all of this together? How do I even begin? They kind of cause us to pause and think about it and then say, okay, let's go back to square one. Let's go back to, Dr. Akamoto at St. Louis,
Yes.
was is off to say, the God is God and we're not, and that's the problem, right? Or something along those lines. But there's a lot of truth to that, and that's both a thing of law and gospel in a sense, right? Thanks be to God, I'm not God, you know. So the confessions really then have this way of forming our, okay, let's start off, okay, did you create yourself? No, you didn't. I believe in God the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth. What does that mean? What does it mean that God has made me? Okay. And then, so who am I as man? Who am I so is sin a part of who I am? Did God create sin? Did God, create me this way to desire what is contrary to his word? So they kind of help shape, how we navigate through this, and then in turn how we can respond to it. Be like, what? You are a creature of God, and you know what? God did not give you these sinful things, but what he did give as you are a Christian is a new heart and a new mind, and a new spirit and freedom to actually live in this life and not be a slave to any and everything, those kind of things like that. And some of this occurs in odd places in the confessions too. I mentioned this in the book, that one place that gives us kind of some insight that just you would swear this is written in 2024, is in the marriage of priest and the apology of the Augsburg Confession. And so here Melanchthon wrote the Augsburg Confession, and he wrote the Apology. And the Apology is not we're sorry for the Augsburg Confession. It's a defense of it, right? So there was a response to it. And one of the places that he's just kind of mentioning how when you forbid priest to marry, just require them, you're actually going against who we are as creatures of God. Not only as creatures of God too, but the institutions that he gives us and who we are as distinctive male and female. So he has this. So briefly, what he says, second, because this creation or divine ordinance in humanity is a natural right, jurists have said wisely and correctly that the union of male and female belongs to natural right. Natural right is unchangeable. Therefore, the right to contract marriage must always remain. Where nature does not change, that ordinance which God gave nature does not change. It cannot be removed by human laws. Therefore, it is ridiculous for the adversaries to babble that marriage was commanded in the beginning, but is not now. This is the same as if they would say, formerly, when people were born, they were born with gender, now they are not. Formerly, when they were born, they were brought with them natural right, now they do not. No craftsman could produce anything more crafty than these foolish things. They were created to dodge a natural right. Now, when does that sound like that was written?
Yesterday.
Yeah, exactly. So the point being then, if you're going to confess the scriptures faithfully, they're not going to change. So even something that was written in, the 1530s, 1531, around that time for the apology, that you think that, so what it does is it helps us to see, okay, now who we are as man and female is ingrained in creation. Marriage is ingrained in creation. I mean, that's a whole other discussion. You can go off on the tail end too of like, well, what does it matter if we defend marriage between a man and woman? Actually, it matters a lot, even for the ordering of our society. And and so when you understand those things, how absurd is it to it's just as absurd to say that you're not born as man or woman. That's crazy talk, right? Because you understand that you're not the creator. You understand that you're a creation of God. But interplaying all of this too is God's care and God's mercy. So in the same breath, then what they'll talk about then as we start unraveling that, unpacking that, is that God treats us, as his children, and that he is our father in all of this. So we're not then just some generic thing, but we actually are known by God, and that we can call God our father, and he does this without any merit or worthiness in us, right? As we confess in the small catechism. So I think that's really like where they help us, really to kind of form our thinking. Like, how do I even approach this? Or how do I see where I fit into all this? Is everything relevant? Well, no, let's have a game plan, so to speak. I'm a systematics guy. So I love this, how this fits together, but it sees where do I fit in this bigger picture? And what does this mean? I talk to people that I serve all the time. One of the best tools you have as a Christian, is what you learned in confirmation class, to ask that question, what does this mean? And the confessions do a great job of teaching us to ask that question and to give answer from the scriptures of what this means. What does it mean to be a man? What does it mean to be a woman? What does it mean, that I'm a creature of God?
At one point, you make the comment that the Lutheran Confessions could really be viewed as a handbook for the baptized.
Yeah.
Talk about that a little bit and how we can turn to them as our handbook.
Sure. Yeah, this idea of a handbook or enchiridion is something that has always been kind of a part of, well, first and foremost, we think of the small catechism, in that regard. of this question and answer. One of the most overlooked sections, I think, of the Small Catechism in particular is the Table of Duties. That section is really helpful, because what it does is it orients our life to who we are as the baptized people of God. So, yeah, and this distinction that the confessions make from the scriptures, that as Christians we are a new creation. So we look at the world differently. We think differently when we look at things. When you and I have a loved one who's a Christian who dies, we look at that differently than somebody who has no hope in Christ. We mourn, to be sure, but also we rejoice knowing that they have life. I mean, so we see even death differently. So what the confessions do as a handbook for the baptized is they help us to understand and unpack what it means to daily live out our life as a baptized child of God. One of those instances that Luther uses in the Large Catechism about baptism is he says, think about it. Imagine if there was a doctor who could, raise the dead or cure the dead. He uses the phrase. So when you think about all of these things, and where you fit into this bigger picture of the Christian faith and what this means for you and who you are as an individual baptized child of God, you see these things informing how you view the world around you, how you view your job, how you view, being a mother or being all of this stuff, and even too, how you view your future, because that's always on the cusp of everything too. As a baptized child of God, is you're always looking toward the horizon. You know what your future holds. Yeah, I don't know what, necessarily what I'm going to have for lunch tomorrow, let alone other things, but I do know what the future holds. Sure, I do. I'm going to rise from the dead just as Jesus is, and I'm going to be with him forever and all of his saints. And that's a wonderful thing. So the handbook for us is then, as we go through life, living in faith toward God and in love toward one another, we see this formative, thought process. We see this formative, even practical, just, going through the 10 Commandments. How do I speak well of my neighbor? How do I, help defend my neighbor's property? That's who we are as the baptized people of God. Just this handbook of our thought process, our thinking, our speaking, and even living in love toward our neighbor. That's kind of I think, a short version of how I would kind of refer to it as the handbook of the baptized. But there's a lot of that even the writers kind of had in mind, that they were intentionally, these documents were not just meant to be, shelved away. They actually were meant to be confessed and taught.
Well, and it helps us really have a thorough understanding of our identity as baptized children of God. And the more firm we're able to rest in that, the easier it is to navigate everything that we're running into in the world, as you've mentioned. And so we can always come back to the comfort that we have, that we know who we are. We may not know what's for lunch tomorrow, but we know what the end is. And so there's comfort in having that solid identity, when so many people in society today seem to be struggling with identity.
Yeah, that's a great point. And that kind of gets to a point that's even a key part of the Reformation as well, is baptism as not only foundational, but baptism as lived out daily. It's baptism is not, I mean, we hear this often, and rightfully so. We don't say I was baptized. We say I am baptized, right? Each day when you rise up, you are a baptized child of God. And that's nothing insignificant to say that, and so that's, so when, like, these documents talk about baptism, they're always understanding it as who you daily are as a Christian, and even into eternity too. I mean, even as something like the church, which they talk about as a tenet of, the church, is that it will remain forever, and you're a baptized child of God forever. It's not just something that it's here one day and gone the next. No, that's forever. Because you're a child of God, and yeah, but it's so formative in our identity, to be sure, but even, and then that spills out then into then how we just go about our daily lives.
So, as we wrap up, why is it so important that as Christians, we are able to confidently confess who Christ is?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it kind of goes back to even what we were talking about at the beginning. So first, just the very nature of the Christian faith is to confess. We will give answer, whether we want to or not, who is the Christ, or who do you say that I am? That's where you come across, and I mean, not to be mean-spirited or anything, like kind of a more non-denominational type of understanding. And they'll say, well, I just believe in Jesus. But we always ask, well, who is Jesus? Who is he? Well, he saves me from sin. What is sin? We have to answer these questions. So I think from just a kind of a starting point, it's for us to confess Christ confidently is to confess the scriptures confidently. The second thing in that too is it understands when you confess Christ confidently and know who he is, you have great consolation and you have great comfort. There are such comforting passages in the Lutheran Confessions that come in odd places that you wouldn't normally think. There's not an article, the comfort of Christ, article, 27 or whatever, but it's all throughout. Like when you understand just who you are as a sinner, and you understand that God freely and fully has lived the life you cannot live, that he has atoned for your sin, that he gives you forgiveness, life, and salvation. It's a wonderful thing. Or even like you look at the article on predestination in the Formula of Concord. Like is that comforting? It's so comforting to know that even before the world was created, even before that, God planned to save you in Christ. So even before he created the world into existence, he was caring about you. And what a wonderful thing that is.
It's powerful.
It's powerful. I mean, and that's where the pastoral care thing too, a doctrine like that, when people are dying, I preach those words to them. I mean, we're preparing for death, as we read the confessions too. I mean, these are orienting us towards the life to come in our resurrection. But so I think, I mean, that really, to confess Christ confidently is to have comfort and consolation. And that's really the goal in all of this too. And that's the beauty that the Lutheran Confessions do. They are just so comforting. You cannot walk away from reading the Lutheran Confessions and not know that Christ has died for you. You can't do it. It's all throughout. And not only that has Christ died for you, but he still cares for you, and you will be with him forever. It's just wonderful. That's the wonderful joy that it is to have our Lutheran Confessions.
So I think, listeners, this is our encouragement to, one, dive into the Lutheran Confessions if you haven't picked them up in a while or ever. And two, I encourage you to learn more about Pastor Wright's new book, Faithfully Formed, The Lutheran Confessions in Daily Life. We will link to that in the show notes. I encourage you to check it out and dig in, because I think you will find that comfort that is given to us all throughout the confessions and all throughout Scripture. Pastor, thank you for being with us today.
Absolutely. Thank you very much.
All right, listeners, till next time. Thank you for joining us on this episode of the Concordia Publishing House Podcast. I pray that this time was valuable to your walk with Christ. We'd love to connect with listeners on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter at Concordia Pub. Visit cph.org for more resources to grow deeper in the gospel.